In this unit, we'll be learning about aerodynamics and flight. Now, I'm sure many of you guys have flown on an airplane before, and you probably understand the basic principles of flight where you get in an airplane and it turns its engines on, it starts to move forward very, very quickly on the runway, lifts off, gets up into the sky, engines are running, it's flying through the sky, and then eventually the plane lands. Hopefully, it lands. Now, there's a lot more behind that as to how it can actually get up into the sky and also stay flying in the air once it is there. It has certain properties that allow for this, and also certain design, just like birds have a certain type of anatomical design that allows for them to fly, which unfortunately the design of our bodies doesn't allow for. So, in order to understand aerodynamics and flight, we have to understand the basics about the atmosphere and what makes it up. So, first off, first question would be what is all over the earth and constantly pushes us around? And that is air. Air is surrounding you, it is everywhere from the surface of the earth all the way to the furthest extent of our atmosphere. And air is a mixture of gases. So often when we think about air, typically we just think the first thing that would come to mind is oxygen, and oxygen's pretty important, which is a good reason why it would be the first type of gas to come to our mind when we think about air. It's what keeps us alive. However, air is made up of many types of gases. It's a homogeneous mixture, and the gas that is most prevalent or that is found in the highest percentages is nitrogen. And nitrogen is the atmosphere is made up of roughly 78% nitrogen molecules. Oxygen accounts for roughly 21% of the gases that are floating around in our atmosphere. And then there's many other types of gases, such as carbon dioxide, which is what we exhale, water vapor, which is another type of gas, argon, helium, hydrogen. So the ones that are in the biggest concentration are going to be nitrogen and oxygen. And a really cool fact about that is that the amount of oxygen is right now, like I said, is roughly 21%. However, way back during the Carboniferous period, when the dinosaurs were alive, it's thought that the amounts of oxygen that were in the atmosphere, or the concentration of oxygen in the atmosphere, was much higher, and that's actually what's responsible for the large size of the dinosaurs and other animals that were living during that time. Like I said before, the air that's surrounding us is exerting pressure on our bodies, and our bodies could not function without that pressure from the air surrounding us. That's called air pressure. And there's the standard air pressure that's affecting our bodies at all time, or what our bodies are used to, is 1 atmosphere of pressure. That's what keeps us put together, and that's what keeps us looking the way that we do, rather than blobs on the ground. So there's various conditions that you've probably experienced where your body has reacted to these changes in air pressure around you. And so one of those conditions would be diving down deep in a pool, or even on a scuba diving, where you're diving even deeper than what you would be in a pool. And so when that happens, the pressure from all of the water surrounding you is actually greater than 1 atmosphere, because you have the air pressure and then you also have the water pressure exerting itself on your body, and you can feel that. You can feel it on your lungs, and you can feel it on your body, and you would go through many physiological changes as a result of that additional pressure. And so on the other end of the spectrum, an example would be when you fly in an airplane. So if anyone if any of you've ever flown in an airplane, something that you might notice is that after takeoff, you start to get to a certain point or a certain altitude, and you feel a popping in your ears. And that is because the air pressure is now decreased. It's less than what it is on the surface of the earth, or it's less than 1 atmosphere. And so that causes the fluid that's inside your inner ear canal to expand. And so you get that popping effect. And so this picture here shows you what happens to a deep sea fish when it's taken out of the water and brought to the surface. So normally the picture you're looking at on the right is this blob fish, and it's a deep sea fish. That's where it lives, and it's used to, or its body is designed for the pressure of the water at those very deep depths under the ocean. Now, when it's brought to the surface, the pressure is decreased, and so what happens is the pressure inside its body is greater than the pressure outside of its body, and so it turns into this blob here. So this video that I'm going to show you does a really good job at explaining why our bodies have aches and pains and why we can actually sense a change in weather within our bodies. And it has to do with that pressure that is exerted by the atmosphere or by all of those air molecules that are surrounding the Earth.
Hey, I'm meteorologist Sige Galindo, and this is The Breakdown. In this breakdown, we are talking about why your aches and pains really can help you predict the weather. A lot of times I run into people and they tell me I know exactly when it's going to rain or snow because I can feel it in my body. I feel those aches in my joints. Or I'll get someone who asks me sometimes, why do I get a headache before it rains or while it's raining? And it's mostly about pressure change. You know, the pressure of the air surrounding us compared to that in our sinus cavities and in our inner ears. The differences between those is what causes pain. We get blood vessels that dilate, abnormal blood flow to the brain. That's what causes our heads to pound, or at least some of us. Now, it's the same concept, the pressure changes and differences, like when you fly. You head to those high altitudes and you get your ears popping because the pressure is changing so rapidly as you fly. And it's usually a sudden change in pressure that causes the headaches or the aches in your body. It doesn't have to be a big change. A lot of times we think, well, the pressure's got to drop a certain millibars, but researchers really found that it could be just a small change in the pressure, and headaches increased by about 6%. So that's affecting quite a bit of us out there. Pressure changes weren't the only causes for headaches specifically. Let's talk about some of the other things that affect it when people complained of headaches as it pertains to weather. Sudden increases in temperature or humidity, sudden drops in temperature or humidity, very high or low temperatures, or very high or low humidity levels. Most storms, we know that as pressure changes, and systems that contain strong wind also had people complaining of headaches quite a bit, or body aches, and changes in altitude, which we just talked about. When you fly, you get that popping of your ears, or sometimes people can, of course, get headaches too. Low pressure usually produces clouds and rain. Now, this is all about the aches in the joints. And when we get that low pressure producing clouds and rain, that causes a lot of moisture in the atmosphere, and that can increase pain and stiffness. Low pressure and moisture changes the flow of the body fluids. So that's what causes those aches in your joints. Body fluids go from vessels to tissue. That causes swelling and pressure on the nerves, increase in fluid in affected areas, and that added pressure once again made people feel really achy in their joints. Hopefully this gives you some insight on how your aches and pains can help you tell the weather. Don't forget, we are streaming
All right, so you might be wondering why I showed that to you, And like I said before, the reason is that all of that and what she was explaining, it has to do with the gas laws and pressure and volume, and the changes that we are feeling and how we're affected. And then also it relates to what we're eventually going to talk about today, which is something called Bernoulli's principle, which is responsible for explaining how airplanes can fly. So the second video that I want to show you was a Mythbusters.
One.
So a little bit of background. What they've done here is they put this this chamber, this suit, in really deep in the ocean, and so it's experiencing increased pressure. However, this suit is pressurized, therefore, inside the suit, the pressure is matching the pressure outside of it, and therefore, anybody inside the suit wouldn't be able to feel any of those changes. So that's how we are able to explore really deep areas of the ocean and these extreme locations. So what they're going to do here is they're going to depressurize the suit. And what that is going to do is it's going to show you what would happen to our bodies if a real human were in this suit and there was a malfunction and it depressurized.
Yep, the effect of the cut hose was less than instantaneous. But once the air pressure was exhausted, physics took over, and the drastic pressure differential pushed Meat Man into his helmet, exactly as the myth predicted.
I don't even think we need to bring him up. No.
All right, so essentially what was happening in that video was that, like I said, the suit was depressurized, and so the pressure outside of the suit was greater than inside, and it actually pushed the man, the suit pushed in on him, and it also caused his body to push upward, and it basically exploded his insides out of his skin from all that high pressure. All right, so the video that you just saw shows how important it is to have that 1 atmosphere of pressure on our bodies, which they are acclimated to, and also what can happen when when that pressure is significantly changed. And it also, I hope it also helps you understand why our bodies are so, from an evolutionary standpoint, why we are so adapted for the conditions that are here on Earth. So the atmosphere is like a sea of air. Right? It has all of those molecules floating around within it. And not only does it have air molecules, but it also has a lot of different particulates, different types of pollution particulates, and soil particulates all floating around within it as well. So it's not just gases that are floating around in the atmosphere. There are other things too. And the atmosphere has weight, and it pushes and presses against things in all directions. So on the surface of the Earth, there are 14.7 pounds per square inch. So the air inside our bodies is pushing back against the air outside of our bodies, and that's why we don't implode or explode. The Earth's atmosphere is made up of 5 different layers. And so in this picture here, you can see what those 5 different layers are. And once you surpass that very last layer, then you would be in outer space. The very first layer is the layer of the atmosphere which is closest to the Earth's surface. And so that layer goes from the surface of the Earth to roughly 4 to 10 miles in height. And so the reason for that variation is there are some really low parts of the Earth's surface, and then there's also some really high parts of the Earth's surface, like Mount Everest. And almost all of the water vapor in the air is located in the troposphere. So because of that, that explains where most of the weather conditions would be found then, since that's where all of the water vapor is found. So that's where we have clouds and storms within the troposphere. So meteorologists typically spend most of their studies on the troposphere. Right, next up is the stratosphere. And the stratosphere is the layer right after the troposphere. It goes from the top of the troposphere upward for about 30 miles. The air is much thinner, and it's typically clear and cloudless in the stratosphere, and you wouldn't find any weather. This is the layer that airplanes and jets would fly, and it makes sense because airplanes and jets, they want to be away from weather because that can majorly affect planes and make it really hard to fly. So they fly above those clouds in order to make flying much safer and also to be able to fly faster as well. So one of the really cool things about flying is when you do pass through the clouds to get to the stratosphere layer, it's just something that's really, really cool to see, especially when you're above the when you're in the stratosphere and you can look down and see all the clouds in the troposphere below. The stratosphere is also the location of the ozone layer, and the ozone layer is really important. You've probably heard about it before. It's like the Earth's sunscreen. So it's this layer around the Earth, almost like a sunscreen that's made up of ozone, and ozone is just three oxygen atoms bonded together, and it blocks UVB, or blocks some UVB rays and all of the UVC rays. So the reason that we put sunblock on is because those UVB rays that do get through and the UVA rays that get through, that's what causes sunburn. So sunblock is a natural barrier to protect against that. The mesosphere comes after the stratosphere, and it's from the top of the stratosphere and it goes upward for about 50 miles. And it has the coldest temperatures, roughly 143 degrees, negative 143 degrees Celsius. This is where the highest clouds could be found, although this would be rare. And then next up is the thermosphere, also known as the ionosphere. And that's from the top of the mesosphere, and it goes for about 400 to 500 miles. The air in the thermosphere is electrically charged by the sun, and it makes for radio reception possible. And it's also where the aurora borealis, or the northern lights, occur. And that has to do with the northern lights happen because of charges that are emitted, I believe, from our magnetosphere. And so we get to see some really cool things like this. So there's one more layer, and once you surpass this final layer, then you would be in outer space. So the last layer is the exosphere, and that is from the top of the thermosphere to space. So that's about 310 miles, and really what that is once you exit the exosphere, you have surpassed the last gas molecule. So there is no air, and therefore there would be no pressure. And this is the layer that satellites typically orbit the Earth. And because there's no air, there would be no friction between the satellites and the air molecules, which would allow for them to safely orbit without heating up due to that friction and being destroyed. There's high intense radiation in this layer, and it's extremely hot, roughly 2,000 degrees, and that's because there is nothing protecting this layer against the sun's radiation. And then finally, you would be in outer space. So that is the Earth's atmosphere and all of its layers and what makes it up. Now that we have a pretty solid understanding of the Earth's atmosphere and its different layers, and also how pressure or air pressure can affect our bodies and how air pressure just affects things in general based on what we know about gas laws, we can put all of that together and start to talk about how airplanes work. So the history of flight is where we're going to start. And it starts off with people having this desire to fly. We see birds flying through the sky and wonder, why can't we do that? And how exactly could we possibly do that? So first there were wing designs. And we look at Leonardo da Vinci's sketchbooks, and we see that he was not only an amazing painter, but also an inventor. And he has all these sketches for drawing flying machines. And people had tried to make wings at that time and come up with all these ideas for flight. So then came balloons in the 1700s. And that's where that idea of the hot air balloon came into fashion, and people were making these balloons that were filled with gases which had to be lighter than the common gas molecules that are found in order to be able to fly into the sky. So then you had balloons, and then after that came airships. So here are two pictures of airships. Were pretty popular in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and airships are commonly called blimps. And when airships were first being used, we were using hydrogen. And if you guys can remember back to the beginning of the school year when we did the demonstration of the different gases in the balloons, you can think about what happened to hydrogen. And if you can't remember that, here's something to jog your memory. So this is the Hindenburg, and this is a hot air balloon or a blimp filled with hydrogen gas, and it's one of the worst disasters of all time. So here's the news report.
Again, the rain had slacked up a little bit. The back motors of the ship are just holding it just enough to keep it from... It bursts into flames. Get it started. It's fighting, and it's fighting. It's rising terrible. Oh, my, get out of the way, please. It's bursting into flames, and it's falling on the mooring fast, and all the folks believe that this is terrible. This is one of the worst catastrophes in the world. Oh, it's like 400 or 500 feet into the sky, and it's a terrific crash, ladies and gentlemen. The smoke and the flames now, and the flame is rising to the ground, not quite to the mooring mast. All the humanity and all the passengers screaming around it. I can't talk to...
All right, so this was probably the end of using hydrogen. Makes sense why. And so then we started switching over to using helium because we know that helium is an inert gas, therefore it is non-flammable. So after airships came gliders, and that's what you're seeing in the bottom picture here. And so gliders are using wing shape to carry them through the air, and we'll talk more about how that shape helps them to fly. But gliders are engineless. And we still use gliders today. There's different types of glider sports and things people do for fun in order to use gliders. But that led the way to our earliest forms of actual flight. So the first engine-powered flight happened on December 17th in 1903 in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. And the Wright brothers were the two people who performed that very first flight. And they weren't the only people who were trying to accomplish flight. Other well-known inventors such as Alexander Graham Bell, Alberto Santos Dumont, and Charles Langley were also competing with them to become the first inventors to accomplish flight. And their first successful flight was about 850 feet long and only lasted for less than a minute. However, it was flight. And so in this next video you're going to see, we'll show you some of their failed flight attempts. All right, so there you have it, the first attempt at flight, a lot different than the flight that we are used to today. So you can see really how with their early hard work, their hard work and all of their effort has led to when we compare that with modern day flight. So now we'll talk about modern flight. Totally different than the video that you just saw. We've had so many advances in modern flight. For instance, the longest direct commercial flight lasts for 18 hours and 30 minutes. And the fastest commercial plane is the Boeing 747-8i, and that can fly at top speeds of 659 miles per hour. If you remember, it's going to be flying in the stratosphere to prevent, because it can fly at those fastest speeds because there's the least amount of air resistance happening. And the fastest manned military jet is the Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird, which can reach speeds of 2,500 miles per hour. And so this right here on the side is the Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird. This up here on the top is a jet plane, and it is a double-decker, which is why you see the two rows of windows. There's a top row and then there's a bottom row, so you can only imagine how many people are aboard this plane, not to mention the number of jet engines that it has. Up top here in the left, this is a private jet, and you can see that and they travel extremely fast, and you can see the engines and then also its unique shape. And so this I thought was pretty cool because it happened just recently. All right, so you have the Blue Angels, which are part of the U.S. Navy, doing a flyover a couple days ago of Philadelphia and New York City. All right. So these pictures here just show you how airplanes have changed over time and how airplanes are made based on the type of utility that we would need them for. So you have your first airplane built by the Wright brothers. Then you have your early war fighter planes, gliders, planes that are equipped for water landings and takeoffs, planes that are equipped for landing and taking off on in Arctic or snowy regions. And then you have military jets and then also airliner jets. So what does all this mean? Well, it all comes together when we talk about Bernoulli's principle. And Bernoulli's principle is the explanation for how planes are able to fly. And so what actually happens is when a plane flies, as it moves forward, the changes in airspeed change the air pressure. And that change in air pressure above and below the wing is what actually allows for planes to fly. So the greater the speed of the air over the wing, over an increased distance, is what causes the pressure decrease above the wing and increase below, which pushes the plane upward. All right, so what that video is just showing you that as the air molecules travel over the wing of the plane, which is in this unique shape like you're seeing right here, the top has the curve, the air molecules on the top are moving faster than the air molecules on the bottom, and they have a further distance to travel. And therefore, that movement, that slower movement on the bottom is what, compared to on the top, is what actually pushes the plane upwards. So this is just showing you that again. The lower pressure is caused by the increased speed over the wing. Those air molecules are traveling much quicker, and the air molecules are traveling slower underneath the wing. Therefore, there's a higher pressure under the wing, and it's going to be pushed upward. That's what Bernoulli's principle explains. So Bernoulli's principle is the single most important explanation in explaining how flight actually works. And there's a whole mathematical equation for it, but we're not going to get into that. So how exactly do airplanes fly? What is the explanation behind that? Well, there are 4 forces that are acting on the plane. The first is lift, and that is when a plane flies forward at a steady speed, the lift balances the weight. So the lift is the upward force. Weight is the force of gravity on the mass of the plane. So that's what's pushing the plane downwards. Thrust is the force that moves the plane forward, and drag is the air resistance or friction with the air molecules that pulls it backwards. So those are all 4 of the forces. The wings and their shape are the most important component of flight. And the wings and their shape are also responsible for moving the plane upward, which only makes sense as to why it's so important for flight, because in order to fly, you have to get upwards into the sky. So lift is the upward force on a plane that counteracts gravity, and gravity is constantly pushing down on the weight, pushing down on the plane and giving it its weight. And that's why if you've ever flown in a plane and they've said that the weight of the plane is too heavy and some of the bags had to come off, that's because the lift couldn't counteract the gravity or the weight of the plane. So because the wing is flat on the bottom, the air can push harder there than on the curved top surface. And so because of its shape, there's uneven forces, and the bottom pushes up harder than the top pushes down, and that's what actually gives it its lift. So looking at this picture here, you have the air, as the plane is moving forward, you have the air as it's rushing over the wing. Notice the shape here. Also, notice how it's shaped like a bird's wing as well. But you have the wind moving over it, and it's moving faster, like I said before, on the top and slower on the bottom, and therefore that is causing an upward force, and it's pushing the plane upward. So if you look here, you can see that the actual, this is an actual wing here, and you can see that its shape is just like what I showed you in this picture. And also these flaps here, these are adjustable. And what these flaps do is they move. If you've ever flown on a plane and you've sat close to the wing, you can actually see these changing throughout the course of the flight. So changing the angle of these flaps changes the speed of the air going under and over them, and that can also change the height that the plane is flying, and so that's really important for a liftoff and then also for landing. And it's also important for pilots to be able to move the plane into higher and lower altitudes depending on the type of turbulence that the plane is experiencing. All right, so this is just going to show you how those work. So as it's departing on its takeoff, you can see that these flaps are moving to change their angle and allow for the plane to achieve liftoff. So it's going to increase its lift and reduce the drag. Notice that the plane's moving faster and faster, and that also has something else to do with lifting off. Now what you'll notice as this plane climbs higher and higher into the sky, these flaps are going to change their angle. See how they're changing right now? And they'll continue to change their angle as the plane climbs higher up in the sky in order to make the flight much more efficient once it reaches the highest altitudes. Okay. So now we know that the wings are probably the most important part of flight, or are the most important flight, and that is because they allow for that lift and that counterbalance of the weight and are responsible based on their shape and Bernoulli's law, or Bernoulli's principle, for getting the plane up into the air as the air molecules move over the wing. And so the second part of flight are the engines. And the engines are responsible for moving the plane forward at its really fast speeds. And airplanes don't need engines to fly. In fact, you have gliders and other types of planes like that that don't use engines and they just ride the airstreams. The jet engines allow for lift to overcome the weight of the heavy jetliners, and they also allow for their fast speed as they're traveling through the air. That's why planes can travel at speeds of 600 miles per hour and even more than that because of those really strong jet engines. And so what actually happens is as the plane moves faster, that would increase the amount of air that's moving over the wing, which allows for that lift and gets the plane up into the air. And like I said before, once it's moving in the air, it moves it forward at a very, very fast speed. So the engines provide thrust, and that's the forward movement of the plane. And that thrust, or that force of the thrust, is going to overcome the drag. And so the drag is going to be that pullback due to the friction of the air molecules as the airplane moves through them. So the thrust has to be stronger than the drag in order for it to be propelled forward, while it's also moving upward. And as the plane moves forward due to the engines, this causes the air to flow over the wing and results in the lift. So, like I said, the engines move the plane forward and the wings cause the plane to move upward. So, putting all of this together, we can watch this video.
Massive airplanes fly. Some of the largest commercial airliners can weigh over 1 million pounds. Compare that to today's heaviest flying bird, the great bustard, which weighs just around 35 pounds. Despite their differences, these two behemoths rely on the same principles of flight. Flight is basically a battle against Earth's gravity, and your greatest ally is the air. Birds and planes alike fight gravity by manipulating the air molecules around them. When birds flap their wings, they're generating an area of high air pressure under the wing and low air pressure above it. The same happens when planes race down the runway. The pressure difference above and below the wing creates a net upward force, giving the aircraft lift. Once this upward force exceeds gravity's downward pull, you have liftoff. Of course, a 1 million pound plane needs greater lift to get off the ground than a great bustard. Planes achieve this with a combination of two things. One, airplanes race down the runway at 150 to 180 miles per hour, creating fast-moving air across the wings. And two, something called the angle of attack. You probably noticed that planes tilt up at liftoff instead of rising parallel to the ground. The reason is that the tilt, also known as the angle of attack, directs more air below the wing. This increases the pressure and gives the plane an extra boost. Once aloft, the main thing keeping the plane in midair isn't magic, it's the engines. Engines propel the plane forward, keeping a steady flow of fast-moving air across the wings. This creates that key difference in air pressure that supports the plane's weight against gravity. But as you fly higher, the air becomes thinner, so the plane must travel faster to maintain that lift. While liftoff speed is around 170 miles per hour at sea level, a commercial airliner's cruising speed is around 550 miles per hour at 40,000 feet, where the air density is 10 times thinner. But a thinner atmosphere means less drag on the aircraft, so the engines can hit high speeds with less fuel. Cruising altitudes between 35 to 40,000 feet are the sweet spot, where pilots can fly as fast as possible while burning the least amount of fuel. Each day, more than 2.5 million people in the US hop on a plane, taking to the sky the same way birds have been doing for millennia. Consider that the next time you're given a safety lesson on how to fasten your seatbelt.